Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars on the energy transition. This afternoon, we're working on a subject that's very close to my heart, flexibility, and specifically market-based flexibility procurement, this time in the context of the Nordic DSOs. And it's a project we've done for one of the research organizations in the Nordics, which my colleague will introduce briefly in a moment. So I'm Stephen Woodhouse. I'm a director with AFRY Management Consulting. I've been with the company and its predecessor names for over 20 years, generally working on the subject of energy market design and disruption to the existing ways of doing things. And this subject of flexibility is really key to the transition to a zero carbon or 100% renewable energy system. Pick your definition. We've been dealing with energy markets and energy only markets and figuring out how to trade energy and get investments for energy services for many, many years. More recently, we've been looking at the concept of capacity on the understanding that the risk associated with an energy only market in a volatile world driven by renewables is becoming perhaps unmanageable. And people have been looking for other tools to manage their investment risks. But for me, capacity is a meaningless concept. It's the capacity to do what? And Britain had a blackout 2 years ago, despite having a capacity payment mechanism, because the flexibility embedded in our capacity mechanism is that the plant can operate with a 4-hour warning, but we don't get 4 hours warning of the types of problem that cause blackouts. So we need to figure out ways of defining new types of product and service for capabilities of different types. And of course, it gets rather complicated because flexibility has many definitions. We need flexibility dealing with instantaneous issues, but also dealing with issues as long-term as seasonal. And increasingly, as we use electric for our heating and solar for our energy resources, you can very quickly see the seasonal imbalance of that, at least in Northern Europe. So we need different types of flexibility. We're getting flexibility from different resources, and some of the traditional providers are getting squeezed out of the system. But we're also seeing new buyers of flexibility. So we're not only seeing the TSO as the buyer of these flexibility services, but as we get finer and finer granularity of the settlement interval and closer to real-time trading, increasingly we're seeing that the market players themselves are the buyers and sellers of flexibility. But also as we electrify transport and heating, we're putting new peak loads on at the distribution level. That would trigger billions of perhaps unnecessary investment in distribution infrastructure. So to avoid or to mitigate some of that investment, we're seeing that the DSOs themselves are potentially buyers of flexibility. So the whole landscape about flexibility markets is becoming, fantastically interesting. And if we solve the conundrums in the right way, we can move relatively cheaply to this, all hallowed, zero carbon energy system. But if we don't solve the flexibility problem in the right way, we'll need to build an awful lot of dedicated infrastructure, which will come, quite expensive, and it will make the energy transition much more expensive than needs be. So, that's the frame for the discussion. I'd like to introduce, or permit himself to introduce, Stian Blackstad Hackett, who's a colleague of mine from our Oslo office. So Stian, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Stian Hackett. I will start with some practical information. Please ask questions throughout the webinar using the question panel that you should see on the screen. At the end of the seminar, we will answer as many as we have time for, including also questions that have been asked before the webinar. And those we don't have time for, we will try to answer by email. So to begin, this project was done by AFRY for Nordic Energy Research, which is an institution organized under the Nordic Council of Ministers. The project has been a collaboration between many different consultants at AFRY from multiple countries. I've listed the 4 main authors here, but several others have also contributed to this, including Stephen. And some of them are also in this webinar, so I would like to also thank them again. I'll go through the report that we've written briefly. You can find it at this link if you want to read it. There's both an online version and a possibility to get it as a PDF if you like. I'll start with a bit of background. These are some excerpts from the Electricity Market Directive of 2019, which indicates how distribution system operators, or DSOs, should approach flexibility. And the first one to the left here, there is a request for DSOs to procure flexibility services in market-based ways, at least as a default. So that would be a change from how many DSOs operate today. And the second excerpt here describes how DSOs should facilitate the use of flexibility for other purposes by resources that are connected to their networks, even if they themselves are not buyers of flexibility. So that also illustrates that flexible resources connected to the distribution grid can be used for different purposes, both by the DSOs themselves in order to address especially local congestion problems. But it can also be used for congestion management at higher grid levels by other system operators, and it can be used for balancing in the balancing markets and in the wholesale and or the wholesale markets. Because as you probably all know, flexibility is one of the ways that we can integrate more intermittent renewables by adapting the demand to the generation patterns of those technologies. When it comes to the objectives of the study, I've listed 3 of them here. They are simplifications of the actually many more individual questions that are listed in the executive summary of the report. But I think it's possible to divide the work into 3 broad parts as listed here. First, to assess the current and future potential and need for explicit flexibility for Nordic DSOs. And I'll come back to what explicit flexibility is in a minute. Second, to explore existing solutions for flexibility procurement, looking at existing markets and pilots, regulatory sandboxes, and so on. And third, to assess different aspects of market design. I should add that in all cases, this was primarily intended from a DSO perspective, in contrast to, for example, a TSO perspective. And when we say that we are looking especially at explicit flexibility, that's because there is often used distinction between implicit and explicit flexibility. Implicit means a reaction to price signals where you set a price and you get a certain volume out of that. While with explicit flexibility, you buy a certain volume at a price that is determined in the market, if it's a market-based solution. As for the methods that we've used, we relied on interviews with various stakeholders, DSOs themselves, but also flexibility service providers, regulators, and also some of the marketplaces or pilots that have been developed in recent years. And I think that some of them are represented here in this webinar today also, so I would like to thank them again for talking to us. We have done our own literature review. We have also done a survey of major DSOs in the Nordic countries with 14 respondents. And that's of course not a representative or a random sample in any way. So we cannot use that for any kind of statistical inference method to say something about the other DSOs. But on the other hand, these DSOs are very large, and altogether they represent a very large portion of the customer base in the Nordic countries, also within each country. So we find them especially important and interesting to talk to. And I should say that another bias that is worth being aware of is that, at least from our understanding, some of these DSOs that we have surveyed may be among those who have the most experience with new forms of flexibility-based solutions. And I guess it's natural that the larger DSOs would typically be the first to make use or to test new solutions for using flexibility. So I'll move on to one of the answers to the survey questions, which was about how DSOs procure flexibility today. And here, as you can see, 9 out of the 14 use so-called interruptible tariffs, which are agreements where a customer is granted a discounted tariff in return for the right of the DSO to disconnect them when they find it necessary. Other long-term bilateral deals are also used. One version of this is so-called conditional connection agreements, whereby a new customer or a customer who wants more capacity would normally have to pay a connection fee or an investment contribution if it triggers an investment in the network. But with this kind of agreement, the customer can avoid this cost if he or she agrees with the DSO to be flexible and can be disconnected when the DSO needs it, with terms that are quite similar to those of interruptible tariffs. Some DSOs, especially in Sweden, report that they're using a market platform, as you can see here. And that's quite interesting. We also asked the DSOs about when flexibility procurement measures are used and how often they are used. So just to help you read the chart here, it says that 2 DSOs report that they often use it in the winter. 6 DSOs say that they sometimes use it in the winter, and so on. And as you can see from the answers here, it's really only in the winter season that they report that it's used often. And that is actually just 2 of the respondents. Otherwise, there are some that answer that it's used sometimes in the winter and partly in other seasons. But the general impression is that flexibility is something that is currently used quite rarely or infrequently, and it's often a seasonal issue. So this is quite different from the short-term daily activations and trades that you see in the wholesale markets. And
we could infer that that's about peak capacity management, perhaps even just from that response alone. So, you know, northern cold, dark winters, peak capacity in the winter season.
Yeah, and I think that plays out with you when you look at some of the other answers that they have given. And especially you see that the winter is overrepresented here compared with the others. Those were answers about how flexibility is used today, but we also asked them about how much flexibility should be used if they were to use it optimally, because you can imagine that there is some kind of optimal theoretical mix of explicit flexibility, implicit flexibility, and investment in the network. And when they were asked to assess a future or how much explicit flexibility they would be using in the future if that mix were optimal, then almost everybody says that it would be used more than it is today. That's 11 out of the 14 who say that. We also asked this question that I showed you right here another time, but this time also with asking them to assume that or how often they would want to use it if it was used optimally in the future. So to try to explain this, in the first question, 2 DSOs said that they often use flexibility in the winter today, but in an optimal hypothetical future, then 5 DSOs say that they would use it often. 7 say that they would use it sometimes in the winter, and so on. And what you can see here is that there is an increase across all of the categories. So there's an expectation or an assessment that it would be good to use it more and more often than today. But at the same time, you see that even though there is an increase, it's also clear that it's not very large. And as you can see, there's no category that is checked by more than half of the respondents. The highest here is 7 out of 14. So it seems that from these 14 DSOs at least, that even when used optimally, the use of flexibility is not assumed to be a very frequent event. It's still a seasonal thing, still a pretty infrequent need. That may be something that ties into the next question that we asked here. We asked them to assess to what extent they expect that actual network investment can be reduced or postponed by means of flexibility procurement, assuming that regulatory policy would provide neutral incentives between investment and alternatives. We found it useful to point that out because we suspect that the regulatory models may not be completely neutral between those two. So we were interested in eliciting what they thought about the technical or the purely economical potential for flexibility to substitute for investment, regardless of, without thinking about what the regulation is at the moment. And most of them replied that only a so-called small share will be affected. These categories are, of course, quite subjective, so don't take it for more than it's worth. We were more interested in differences between countries for this particular question. Yet I think it's worth noting that it's not like everybody's answering that it's a very small share. You have even somebody who says that it's a very large, or large share, I mean. And so it's definitely not expected to be zero. And another point is that if you look at the investment that is needed in the networks in order to accomplish the energy transition, even a so-called small share or very small share could actually be a lot of money. So we have one more slide from the survey. You can find more in the report itself, but we don't have time to show everything. But I think that this one was interesting to include. This is an overview of how the respondents look at current barriers to flexibility procurement. And one of the clearest findings here is that all except one say that the incentives from the regulatory model, or I should say models, because there's one in each of the Nordic countries, is a barrier. And this could suggest that then it may be worth looking more closely into these regulatory models. We did not explore in detail in the report what exactly it is about the regulatory models that stands in the way. It may differ between countries, but we suspect that in part at least it could be has something to do with how investment-related costs are favored over operational expenses. That's at least the case in aspects of the Norwegian model, which we know quite well. Also worth noting here is that more than half point out that there is a problem with the lack of flexibility providers, and especially the lack of reliable flexibility. Those are the second highest and third highest category here. And we think that this has something to do with how DSO congestion management problems are often quite local in scope. There are few providers, and there is a need for flexibility resources to have a certain reliability before they can be considered as real alternatives to investing in the network. And finally, another interesting observation here is that half of the respondents say that the lack of knowledge within the DSO is a challenge or a barrier. And that's interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, there is reason to think that these DSOs that we have surveyed are probably among the more advanced when it comes to using new flexibility solutions. So if half of these companies report that there's a knowledge gap, it could be that there's an even bigger knowledge gap in many of the smaller DSOs. And if you're not familiar, the Nordic countries have a large number of small DSOs. So to summarize a bit from the interviews and surveys, DSOs do see a growing importance of flexibility solutions, but they don't expect it to have a very large impact on the net need for network investment. Although, as I said earlier, maybe even a small share could be very meaningful in terms of the sums of money that are involved. DSOs often emphasize the importance of long-term, reliable agreements in order to function as viable alternatives to investing in the grid. With an optimal future use of flexibility as they see it, activations are not expected to be very frequent and to be seasonally dependent. And they're still, especially in the winter, among the DSOs that we have surveyed. But that could have something to do with having surveyed more DSOs in some of the countries. We can't really say that this is universal for all DSOs in the Nordic countries. But that there is this kind of seasonal component is something that we saw from the ones that we surveyed. And that current regulatory incentives are identified as a barrier to use flexibility. So I'll turn to market design. We describe in the report some of the benefits of market-based procurement and the difference between that and the solutions that are currently being used, such as interruptible tariffs, for example. Some of the benefits are listed here. For example, access to the cheapest sources of flexibility. The cheapest source of flexibility, or the merit order of flexibility, if you want, is something that is always changing, especially when you're talking about demand response. And buying flexibility when there's a need for it instead of overbuying it. Elicit the real willingness to buy and sell flexibility versus the alternatives. The point is not to maximize the use of flexibility, but rather to find the right value so that you can make a good comparison between that and network investment and other possibilities. From our research, we have also found that if flexibility markets are to be useful for DSOs, there are probably some typical characteristics that will be recurring, even though we think that these markets may be quite different depending on the use cases and the local circumstances. But some recurring features are expected. For example, reliability and long-term assurances of availability are something that many DSOs emphasize, especially important for highly local problems. High liquidity as much as possible. That's always useful in the market. As mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to come by for very local problems, but the market design should at least try to make it as easy as possible for resources to participate and not put unnecessary barriers in the way for that. Options to buy availability on both longer and shorter time horizons when possible. That's also an advantage. It's useful for the long term because of the long time horizon of network investments, but it can also be useful to buy in the more or in the short term because you can capture this value of flexibility that varies even from day to day, and to buy it also in the more intermediate time frame. For example, when one detects that there's a heightened risk of an outage, for example, due to bad weather. We describe in the report some examples from Finland on that. The key value of that would be that when a flexibility resource is not necessarily needed right there and then it can be used for other purposes freely. And it will then be more profitable to invest in, and that will also benefit the DSO when they need access to that kind of resource. Another issue that is not listed here explicitly, but that we have also picked up is that there's a value of having a so-called secondary market solution, where those flexibility providers who have an obligation to deliver available flexibility can transfer that commitment to another party. so that they're not stuck with it for a too long time. And that's also something you can read more about in the report. And finally, regulatory incentives should enable DSOs to optimize the use of flexibility. As I said, it's not about trying to maximize it by any means necessary, but try to find the optimal value and the right value for it, so that you can optimize the use of flexibility and the other alternatives. So another important part of the study was to look at existing markets that have been established. We have looked at several markets and pilot initiatives for market-based procurement, and especially the 4 that you see here. These are probably among the more advanced solutions that exist currently in Europe. And you also see these 4 referenced and described in other reports. There's a lot that you can say about them, but since our time is a bit limited here, I will focus mainly on their differences in products as they currently exist, but they're always changing. So it's easy to become, it's easy for information to become outdated here. But at least from the beginning, Picloflex has been focused on long-term contracts obtained through an auction, while Enera and GoPax have focused more on shorter-term activation markets, more like the intraday market. In fact, GoPax is simply an extension of the intraday market in the Netherlands, where bids are being supplemented by geographical locations in order to be available for congestion management by system operators. Nodes is something that combines both long-term availability contracts with the short-term activation markets. So they try to find a solution that takes both of these concerns into account. It does appear, however, that at least according to this article that we cite here at the bottom, which describes the same 4 markets that we are focusing on, that Piclo may be adding a market mechanism for short-term activation, while Enera and GoPax may add the market mechanism for reservation. So maybe it could be that we are moving towards some kind of hybrid solution for several kinds of markets. One of the explicit research questions that we were asked by Nordic Energy Research to look at in the study was the advantages and disadvantages of many or few marketplaces for procurement of local flexibility. In Nordic countries, there are several hundred DSOs, so in theory, there could be a large number of very small marketplaces. At the other extreme, there could be one large centralized solution where every DSO could buy flexibility. And there are certain benefits of each. One way that we have tried to conceptualize this is through this illustration from the report. These are not really market models, even though it may be looking like that, but rather it's more of a summary of the different concerns of DSOs and buyers of flexibility, as buyers of flexibility, I mean, and of flexibility service providers, or FSP as they're abbreviated here. So to take you through this, in Exhibit A, we are looking at the concerns of the DSO, what they would like to see in some kind of competitive marketplace, namely that they get access to flexibility from many different flexibility providers, and perhaps ideally through a shared market platform. So then they only have to interact with one market, and from there they can get competition between service providers to provide the services that they need. That will give them liquidity, and that will give them ease of access to the providers, and to provide competition that can bring down the cost. If you look at it from the perspective of the flexibility service provider, they have a different main concern, because they want to, at least if they're aggregators, they may have resources located in many different DSO areas, and they would ideally want to avoid having to connect manually to a lot of different marketplaces. all with their own possibly idiosyncratic rules and methods. So, and if it becomes too complicated for them to adapt to a lot of different small marketplaces, then there's a risk that maybe they will not establish themselves in some areas. That would lead to less liquidity for the DSO. But they would like to have easy access to many different buyers of their services, both DSOs and also other buyers and markets. For example, the TSO balancing markets. So it seems like, at least when it comes to aggregators, there are benefits associated with marketplaces that can connect multiple flexibility service providers with multiple DSOs. And this is indeed done in some of the markets we look at. Then there's, of course, still a question of how large and how comprehensive the marketplace should be. A large marketplace will benefit from economies of scale and product standardization and provide everybody with simplified methods of access to the counterparties. But one risk of that is that it could be too top-heavy. There could be too little competition. That could also lead to a lack of innovation. We think that it's useful to emphasize competition and innovation strongly at this stage because market solutions and pilots are still being developed and tested. And that brings me to this last point here. Learning and innovation from the pilots and existing markets that we have looked at is still going on. So at least at the current model, current moment, I mean, it seems a bit risky to commit too strongly to one particular very comprehensive and centralized architecture, while the process of learning and adaptation is still going on. But we think that there are certain things that can be done, certain steps that can be taken during this time. For example, DSOs can learn from each other in the development of flexibility products, or at least the least common denominators of those products, by looking at DSOs that have been involved in pilots and other markets through industry organizations and so on, forums, for example. We also think that developing systems or continuing to developing systems for information exchange between system operators will be beneficial in any case. This will be beneficial also without a flexibility market, just to help with incorporating the large amount of intermittent renewables that is coming. But it will also be an important pillar for enabling efficient coordination between system operators in a flexibility market. And as mentioned earlier, incentives for flexibility in the regulatory models may need to be looked at. We don't know exactly what we will find, but it seems like when 13 out of 14 DSOs say that this is a barrier, then it may be worth a look. And as a part of that, regulators may also need to look at the interplay between the development of commercial markets with the current tools that we have, such as interruptible tariffs. And this also ties in with the rules for who should really pay for network capacity, for example, through connection fees and investment contributions. Because it may stand to reason that if you have rules for who should pay for the network, that should also have implication for who should pay for the alternatives to the network, if flexibility is going to be the alternative to network investment that we hope it can be. So that was the
I'd like to just pick up on that very last point. In Britain now, we're saying that it's becoming quite normal to get what are called flexible connections. So when people want EV chargers or heat pumps, they're quite commonly being given non-firm access. So there's a lot of debate going on at a European level now. What is the appropriate charging structure for networks, tariff structure? And for me, that's not the right question, because the price is what you pay for the service you get, but we should be questioning what is the level of service. So there are three aspects to that. There is your terms of connection, which is speed and cost of connection. There is your access rights, which is the degree to which you get firm or non-firm or something in between. So in a sense, the compensation you're entitled to if you can't get to do everything you want. So your connection and your access rights. And then we talk about your charges. And to talk about only one part of that without looking at the whole lot in the round seems to be mistaken. So we should not really be rolling out millions of EV chargers and millions of heat pumps with a presumption that they will be used in the winter peak. That seems to be mad from my perspective. So we do need to be looking at these things in the round, I would have said. So Stian, thank you for presenting, so comprehensively what was, quite a substantial body of work. And I think it's the basis for further work rather than a series of answers in its own right. And as I say, this topic of flexibility, and in particular, the billions of DSO investments that will be needed in the coming years as we make this transition towards electrified heating and transport, which is the fundamental game changer at a distribution level. That how we answer these questions will be very important, and indeed it will be different in different countries. So on the, remember conferences when you used to go and meet people and chat to them over a coffee break? I had a conversation with somebody from Enedis in France who said, well, we will be replacing induction. We have electric heating in nearly every house in France. We'll be replacing induction heating with heat pumps, which will free up, I don't remember if he said 6 or 8 gigawatts of capacity at the lowest voltage level, which will give us total freedom to electrify all of the transport and put EV chargers everywhere. So we don't expect to have a fundamental capacity problem when we electrify transport. Whether that's true universally, I don't know. Norway, I was told, at least outside the cities, basically every house has electric heating and a 3-phase supply. So the incremental investment required to get EV charging as well is not very much. I was told again in Norway, we may not expect huge capacity constraints. So I worked with the design of the nodes energy market, where Agder Energy were looking at the Engene substation, a way of using a local flexibility market to mitigate their need for investment. So there will be hotspots in every country, but in other places, you might see a very big problem as we start to electrify heating and transport where it hasn't been done before. So I think the solutions will be country specific because the technical needs will be country specific. And the other issues which are country specific are, customers' willingness to engage. Are customers willing to give up freedoms or not? And certainly in certain countries, and I know Estonia is one of these cases, I know Italy and France are these, the customer already buys a capacity limit and they can choose the level of capacity that they wish to pay for. So the concept that there's a price for kilowatts as well as a price for kilowatt hours, in some countries, people already understand that. In Britain, forget it. So, and customers' willingness to lose total control over the time when they have their heating or their electric vehicle charging, they're really the domestic flexibilities that matter. I think that will be a societal thing, and we might find different answers in different countries. So, we're not going to have a universal marketplace and set of product definitions for local flexibility, I would expect, not for a very long time to come. So, Stian, shall we move on to some of the questions? And I've been doing my best to keep on top of the questions that are coming up actually on the day. I think there's one still open. But do you want to pick up on some of the questions that we've been asked in advance? So I think you'd highlighted a few of the ones that you wanted to answer. It's probably best that you read them out, do them in the order you prefer. I think we've still got 5 minutes.
Yeah. So one of the questions we got was as follows. An ET, we interpret that to mean an energy transition. An energy transition focused on radical change towards net zero represents uncertainties about the appropriate future fundamental organization of the power/energy markets. To what extent and how could this be relevant also for a hydro-based system with lots of storage? And that description would be very fitting for especially Norway, and partly also for Sweden and Finland. Hydropower also acts as a source of flexibility for Denmark through the connectors. And it's true that on a system-wide level, the flexibility of hydropower solves many of the problems that other countries may have with the integration of renewables like wind and solar. At least it becomes easier when you have that flexibility resource already in place. But there are also some problems that hydropower cannot help with, for example, very local congestion problems, which is something that is very relevant for DSOs and what we are focusing on in this report. So for that kind of problem, hydropower doesn't really help that much, if at all. And but it's also the case that when you have this kind of flexibility resource on the system-wide level in the form of hydropower, then that means that local flexibility resources will probably not make as much revenue as they otherwise could for serving that kind of need. So if you think about flexibility resources as having a use both at the local level and at the system-wide level, if you reduce the revenue that they get at the system-wide level, maybe there will be less investment in them, and that will also affect the supply of flexibility at the local level. So there's a kind of indirect or oblique effect on that also in the hydro-based system. I'll try to take another one.
Let me pick up the next one. It was should the DSOs play a more active role in security of supply? And if so, how do the regulatory models need to change for this? And I think there's a question and a hidden question. So yes, the DSOs will play a role in the security of supply, and they will be moving towards a role of active management rather than kind of build the network and more passive management. But what the hidden question is, do we think there should be, the DSOs should take responsibility for security of supply on a local level? And I think, in a world with retail competition and the innovation that brings, I would say, no, that's the wrong direction. I can imagine some possible future world where we have enough local flexibility and generation resources to allow, under extreme circumstances, the management of local islands. So if you get a problem with the main grid, you can maintain security of supply on an island basis. But I think we're a long, long way away from that future. But it's maybe somewhere we go when we get worried about cybersecurity. So I think the DSOs will increasingly be facilitators of distributed flexibility. By that, I mean they must not get in the way. They will also be buyers of distributed flexibility to help with their own network congestion needs. They will be, coordinators and providers, but I don't think they will be central actors in this. I've seen models in which the DSO is somehow the middleman for all distributed flexibility to sell services to the TSO. And although we need to solve the DSO-TSO coordination issues, my opinion is that the DSO doesn't become a primary actor in this security of supply issue. Security of supply is already not the responsibility of the TSO in most countries. It's kind of the responsibility of the market, with the TSO responsible for operational coordination. I'm not sure I would see even the DSO having that level of responsibility apart from kind of local voltage management. But I know there's room for different models here.
Yeah, so it seems like that's maybe the last question we have time for.
Sorry. But this is a very, very interesting topic, and we would love to continue the dialogue. So the Q&A in the session, I think, is going to still be open for a few minutes. Drop anything in there, and if there are questions that we haven't answered, we'll try and pick them up by email afterwards. And everybody will get access to the slides afterwards, and we will perhaps try and answer these questions and circulate the answers to those key questions afterwards. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We've put the link to the report into the chat, but it's easy to find. And we'll send all of that out later when we follow up by email to everybody who signed up for the webinar. So on that note, I would like to thank Stian for the hard work and for the excellent presentation. And I would like to thank our audience members for taking the time to listen, and for those who actively participated in the Q&A. We'll do our best to follow up with the answers to those questions. And do contact us if you want to discuss the topic further.